Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Glenn McGourty. I work for the University of California as the county director and wine growing plant science advisor for Mendocino and Lake counties. I'm really glad that everyone is here today with us and be prepared to learn a lot.
I'm Kate Frey, and I'm really excited to be giving this class with Glenn. I'm a garden consultant and designer and educator and writer and lover of all plants.
All right, awesome. If you guys are ready, I will stop talking and hand it over to Glenn, who will start things off.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So we're going to start kind of with basics. One of the things that I always like us to sort of understand is exactly how we came here, geologically speaking, and what how that has affected where we're gardening. And hold on a sec here while I get myself totally adjusted and ready to go. So this is kind of an introduction to North Coast geology and soils, and we're just going to take a few minutes to look at where we are on the continent. We're going to learn about the unique geology of our region because we are in a really different place compared to the rest of the United States and the planet. We'll look at the geological processes that formed our landscape, a very basic introduction into soil types and why organic matter is important. And then we're going to build on that. So I'm going to start kind of giving the sort of nerdy science approach, and then Kate's going to really zoom in on the more important aspects of what do you do practically as a gardener. California is a very unique place geologically, and the reason for that is we are where two sizable tectonic plates come together, the North American plate and the Pacific plate, which is right around here. If we go back in time 100 million years, and as my kids joke, I was a freshman in high school back then, but here you are. Where we're standing today 100 million years ago was probably under the water. The Sierras were already formed, but they had beachfront property. And what was going on is that the Pacific plate was going under the North American plate. And there was some leakage as this magma was from the mantle of the earth was coming up. It was leaking into the ocean underneath the water and forming what we call the Franciscan complex, kind of a mixture of the underground sandstones and also the magma that was leaking into the ocean. So here we are today, and what is really interesting is that we live in a bumpy neighborhood, as many of you know. There's a lot of earthquakes that occur, particularly off of Petrolia and Cape Mendocino, and that's because there's three major tectonic plates that come together there. The North American plate, the Pacific plate, and then the Juan de Fuca plate, with the sub area known as the Gorda plate, and they all meet there off of Point Cape Mendocino, and what happens is that there's the potential for a lot of slippage and breakage. Also, we have part of our West Coast moving north and part of the West Coast moving south. And it's really interesting because at the southern end of Mendocino County, once upon a time, that landmass was actually down around San Diego, and it's moved that far north. So if we were to sit there, if we wait long enough, we'll end up in Alaska maybe 100 million years from now. But just goes to show you that everything is moving. Global tectonics really affect this area, and this is a very, very active area on the North American continent. So this is just a map that kind of illustrates how we have these series of mountains, and as these plates subduct, it kind of scrapes off the top, and then you end up with the various mountains that we find here on the North Coast. So there's Santa Rosa here, here's Ukiah, here's Clear Lake, and beyond. The other really active geological process that goes on is uplifting and erosion. So this was the first thing that was uplifted, and it formed kind of an alluvial basin here, and then that got eroded, and then it forms another alluvial basin which continues to erode. So we have these kind of bumpy valleys and flat areas. Not a lot of them, particularly in Mendocino County, but this is really active geological processes that form the landscape. And we can see it in places like Anderson Valley. So this was the original uplifted ridge. It formed kind of an alluvial area here, which then eroded and as another area was uplifted. And now we have the valley floor here. So we can see very actively the processes. And whoops, what you need to understand is that the oldest soils are up here on the ridge top. They may be somewhere from 40 to 200,000 years old. And down here, these are the newer soils that are somewhere between last year and 10,000 years old, depending upon how active the water is on the landscape. These soils are fertile and deep, and these soils tend to be shallow and old and less fertile. The other thing that's very active is the power of the sea. The ocean is pounding the west coast, and it's causing rocks to break down, which is how soil is formed. As the rocks weather and get broken into smaller pieces, they form our soil. And building on the west coast, along the edge of the west coast, is probably not a good idea. You can see this very expensive home has a bunch of breakwaters, and eventually it's going to go bye-bye, because it's just, you can see just looking at the coast, there's constant erosion and roughness here, and that's the way it was designed to be. Now, the same thing happens along the coast of erosion and uplifting, and we can really see this, what we call the staircases around the town of Mendocino, where uplifting followed by erosion, these are usually sandy benches, and it repeats over time. So we know of at least 5 benches as we go back from the town of Mendocino, and the soil types can vary greatly. Some places are great where we have nice big trees, and some places aren't so good because there's cemented layers underneath the soil horizon, and we call those the pygmy forest, because basically things can't root very deep, and it's not a great place to garden. So on average in the North Coast, our soils are weathered sandstones that once used to be marine bottom. They probably were somehow deposited there by a combination of water and gravity. They have moderate fertility and low pH, and here we have a very nicely formed soil profile. So you can see down here, we're getting close to the sandstone parent material. And as you go up, it turns black. And the reason it's turning black is because this is really an active biological zone. This is about how far oxygen moves down into the soil along with roots, and organic matter is formed. And as organic matter is formed, it consists of decaying plant material and animal material, and it ends up being carbon, and carbon is black, and that's what gives soils those nice dark colors. Now, another process is volcanics, and in Lake County, we have mysterious Mount Canocti, as I call it. It's about 500,000 years old. It last erupted probably about 13,000 years ago. It's reputed to have a large cavern inside, and people claim that they can hear the mountain breathe. So we know there's caverns in there. I don't know that it's been explored. If it has, it's not public, but it's just to show you volcanics are very much a part of the West Coast mountain system, particularly as we get down here in Napa, Sonoma, and Lake counties. It's very clear the volcanic activity that's been going on. And again, where the tectonic plates are going up and down, they often form volcanoes. If we dig down the soil profile, we can find minerals associated with volcanics, such as what we call bottle rock or pyroclastic rock or obsidian. And the obsidian was traded all over up and down the West Coast by Native Americans for making arrow points. And we also have Lake County diamonds, which are shiny and look kind of like glass. I forget the exact mineral name for them, but they're common to find in the volcanic areas. The other thing that is really important in our landscape, and if you're unfortunate enough to have this on your property, is going to be another game changer for you. This is Franciscan rock. These are where basically we have uplifted marine sandstones kind of interacted with the weakly stratified tumbled ultramafic rock. It was basically magma boiling up from the sea bottom through fissures into salt water, and that forms these serpentine rocks, this very famous gray colored rock. And as that weathers, it forms basically high magnesium glob. It could also have high levels of manganese and nickel in it. Asbestos sometimes shows up, and very unstable and prone to slippage. And any of us who've lived on the North Coast can remember times where Highway 101's been closed in sections or lanes blocked off, or sometimes completely closed. And it's because this rock is so unstable. When it gets wet, it has a tendency to get loose. And if you have high magnesium in your soil, it makes for very poor gardening conditions. It tends to be higher pH. It tends to be very difficult to get it to form a good soil, because it resists becoming porous, and it stays pretty gloppy. and then it may also be toxic as well. So that's kind of just a real thumbnail sketch of some of the geological processes that formed us, the North Coast for us, and where you live depends somewhat on what the parent material was in terms of rocks, and then as those rocks weather, they form soil. Now we're going to talk just real briefly about what are good soil conditions. Well, the ideal soil, if we were to squeeze it all out, would be, we'd find about 50% solids, 25% water, and 25% air. And if you actually look at it kind of in cross-section, you can see here that there's a lot of spaces in between the soil particles. And this is important because soil needs to be kind of like a sponge. It needs to be able to have water and air go through it easily. We want water to move in fairly rapidly, but then stay, kind of coating the soil particles and then leaving air gaps in between. And organic matter is very important in the soil to kind of keep it in soft, good condition, so it's easy for the roots to go through. Plus, it also holds nutrients. We break everything down. We talk about the texture of a soil, and there's really three particle sizes. There's sand, silt, and clay. And this is how soil scientists think about a soil when they're describing it. The particle sizes give really different qualities to the soil. So we can see here's a close-up of sand. Sand particles are very coarse, they're gritty to the touch, and proportionally they don't have a lot of surface area, so they're not very fertile because of that, because they can't hold on to fertilizer the way that finer textured soils can. They don't hold water very well, although water moves through them very quickly, which is a nice thing. So when you're irrigating, you rarely have puddling in sandy soils. The water moves right down. We don't consider this to be prime vegetable ground, but it's very good for root crops if you can keep the moisture if you're in a coastal climate. So on some of the old coastal benches, they used to grow potatoes, and they grow beautifully there because sandy soils and potatoes go hand in hand. And as long as you can keep adequate moisture for things to grow, it works out really well. Next are silt. And silt's kind of a medium particle size, but you see how they're really flat? So they have one really bad quality, is that if you work them at the wrong time and you work them too hard, they'll seal. They're deposited typically by wind and water, but especially by wind. So a lot of the Midwest is silt soils that have blown off the Rocky Mountains as the Rocky Mountains have weathered. They can be moderately to very fertile. They're difficult to farm due to this tendency to the soil to cake. And they're important farm soils in the Midwest. We find them along watercourses in California, and they're highly erodible. Clays, now, these are the finest particles of all. And if you can see here, see how they're kind of layered? So they have a lot of surface area because they're very, very small. So they have the ability to hold on to fertility and water pretty well. So that's kind of the best thing about them. They're the smallest particle sizes. They're fertile for the most part because this is where a lot of potassium and other nutrients are held. They're pretty difficult to wet, but they stay moist the longest. We find them everywhere, but especially in the bottom of the landscape where water settles. And they can be difficult to garden in because it ranges from sticky to wet when wet to hard when dry. So, we always talk about there's about 15 minutes a year where it's ideal to work these soils, and the rest of the time it's going to be difficult. And it's really important to keep them properly watered. You never want to let them get too wet or too dry, and that's why drip irrigation on clay soils is pretty perfect. And we're going to talk about that in the fourth series of managing your garden. Lastly, organic matter is decomposed plant and animal residues. They help bind soil particles together to give the soil structure. So it's kind of like when you're making a cake or something. So if you don't have leavening in the cake, it tends to be like a tortilla, but when you make it porous and spongy, then it's really good for plants to grow in, and you have nice roots, penetration. Organic matter is a very good source of plant nutrients, and it gives the soil its dark color as it coats the mineral portion of the soil. It's easy to manipulate and change in the soil. You can't change soil texture very easily. So if you have sand, silt, or clay, that's what you're going to garden in unless you're prepared to bring in a lot of new soil. On the other hand, by adding organic matter, you can make everything better because it increases the fertility and the water holding capacity and the ability of the soil to kind of aggregate and become more sponge-like and less pancake-like. So we can bring up soil nitrogen, potassium, sulfur, and phosphorus, and we can improve the availability of micronutrients. These are fertilizers we need in small amounts, such as iron and zinc. We'll improve soil water holding capacity. We promote soil organisms ranging from earthworms to fungi and bacteria, and as they work through the soil, they make the soil better. And they in turn improve the rooting environment for plants. So we have two ways of getting it there. Cover crops are a really good way for large spaces, and compost for smaller areas. And compost is basically decomposed, recycled organic matter that's been allowed to heat up and get digested by microbes. So that, in a nutshell, is kind of our very fast tour through soils. And that should set the stage for Kate to talk about the next part of our show, which is going to be how do you actually manage this in the garden? Okay, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Glenn. That was fantastic, and you're keeping on time. That's great. Real quick, Kate's going to start talking next, and we're all excited to hear what she has to say. Just want to let everyone know, since we have a lot of people who joined, the meeting is being recorded, so just be aware of that. If you have questions for the presenters, there'll be a Q&A session at the end. Please use your the chat box that is at the bottom of the screen and save your questions for the end. You can post them now if you want, but we will kind of moderate those till the end. So thank you, Kate. If you want to go ahead, it's all yours.
I'm going to talk about the practical aspect of gardening with soil and growing vegetables with soil. And I'm going to go really quickly and through some of what Glenn talked about, but reiterating it in a different way. And some things I'm just going to skip over just so we've got more time to talk about the practical aspects of soil. But basically all plants have evolved or adapted to specific types of soil characteristics, structure, depth, organic matter levels, and vegetables and annual flowers really need coddling. They need a nice friable soil with high levels of organic matter. And so I'm going to talk about various ways to get there and how to maintain those. And so just an example of other plants requiring different conditions, drought-resistant native plants, Mediterranean plants, many of them need much lower levels of soil fertility and soil organic matter, but often need well-drained soil. So soil type is really important for us as gardeners because we're going to approach our care of it, development and care of it a different way, like in sandy loam. As Glenn mentioned, soil particle sizes are large, drains very quickly, so irrigation lines are needing to be closer together. You're going to water more frequently, usually add organic matter more often because it burns up or is used up more quickly. Clay soils can initially often be problematic. This is worst case scenario. But organic matter also really improves these conditions as well. Clay soils are actually really excellent for gardening once the organic matter levels have been improved. Many of our native soils have 1% or less sometimes soil organic matter, and vegetables really need about 6%. So, and this can really improve even the worst soils. So to get to know your soil, just simply dig a hole. This can be just a simple, just with a shovel, dig 2 feet deep and see what's there. And I think particularly if you live in a newer housing development, then I'm just going to go through these quickly. It's important because oftentimes you have a whole mixture of soils. Some have been brought in. Oftentimes there's compaction, and so it's good to know these things. So this is an illustration of how water moves in these different soils. And so this is, we're going to go through this more later in another one of the classes. But this is just really important to know so you could visualize what's happening underground. So as Glenn mentioned, soil structure is really important because soil texture is the mineral component of the soil. Basically what you have in your yard. The soil structure is really important and easy to change because plants' roots are interacting with it. Plant roots and soil organisms need oxygen just as much as we do. So we want to try to encourage our soil granules, whether they're sand, silt, or clay to clump or aggregate together so water, air, and roots and soil organisms can move easily through. And so soil structure really strongly influences root growth and plant health. And it's easy to improve with the addition of compost, cover crops, and also with no-till, and we'll talk about that. So soil with good structure often has its crumbly, cake-like structure and often wormholes. So again, as Glenn mentioned, compost is just excellent as a nutrient resource. It also buffers pH, helps correct nutrient imbalances, but really importantly helps to develop good soil structure, and also helps soil retain soil moisture, really important for us in dry climates. It also feeds soil biology that keeps soil and plants healthy. So we'll get into the practical part now, but I thought I'd start with just a really short case study. So this is the hole that I showed you before, which is, so this is year one. This is the old Fetzer Valley Oaks garden in Hopland. And so this was our first year of gardening, and the soil was, I think, 1% soil organic matter. And year one, we had really poor plant growth, sparse foliage, which equaled sunburn on the melons, peppers, and we had terrible blossom end rot on the tomatoes, spider mites from dry, dusty conditions. So this felt pretty discouraging. So we recognized that soil was key, and to improve the soil, we planted cover crops in the fall of oats and legumes like beans, or not beans, peas, fava beans, and vetches, and then tilled them in late March and April. We tilled in truckloads of compost, which we had from the winery. And 4 years later, we had this absolute cornucopia and profusion of healthy, productive plants. Just an amazing transformation. However, most of you don't have large gardens and don't have access to equipment. So we're going to talk about those situations. So many people garden in raised boxes. And this is a winery tasting room in Sebastopol. And these look like nice raised boxes, but in reality, the soil is underneath them, or probably just a little bit deeper than the pathway level, was compacted by bulldozers. So these raised boxes are really shallow. They're probably only 8 or 10 inches deep. So these are amended each growing season with about 1 to 2 inches of excellent compost from Sonoma Compost Company, based in Petaluma. And this is the organic compost that's manure-based. Additionally, we put on California Organic Fertilizer Company's 757 fertilizer. And so I'll show you the results of that. So that's the summer, and there's a lot of vegetables there on the right. That's quinoa, or on the left, and plants for pollinators. And there's a winter garden. So obviously these soils are incredibly shallow, but with the addition of good, excellent compost and fertilizer, you really can grow some amazing crops and healthy plants. And these look great for a very long growing season. Many people, again, have these raised boxes. They can be shallow or deep. And so these are treated differently than growing plants in the ground. Many times these are filled with soil that's been brought in, or bagged potting soil. So soil in them often drains quickly, nutrients run through them quickly. And so each year you want to, really summer or spring and fall, if you're growing in them practically year round, you'll want to add some compost. It might only be an inch or two, and some fertilizer. And pictured is feather meal there on the left. It's ground chicken feathers. It's 1200. This is just purely nitrogen. And the beauty of this fertilizer is it lasts all summer. And that the other California Organic Fertilizer brand 757 is also feather meal base. So the 7 is representing the feather meal. And so this is really an excellent fertilizer. Often it's used in conjunction with other things because obviously it's only nitrogen. And calcium has also been added to this bed. The compost is organic, and so this was then mixed in. So you want to first put the fertilizer down, then put compost on top, and then you can just very lightly mix it in. Let me just go back. Or if you have really excellent soil, you could just leave it on as a top dressing. So some people really like to dig their beds. Other people are going in a more no-till direction. So it depends on the soil you got in your beds. If you have nice loam, you can just probably put it on top and then plant into it. If you have bagged potting soil in your beds, you probably want to do some mixing in. If you're seeding into beds, again, or soil is poor, just lightly mix in the compost and amendments, as you do want them to have the seed to have soil contact rather than just be planted in compost. These big deep boxes were filled with soil and compost mixed together, and then the amendments were mixed in the last 8 inches of the soil, the top 8 inches of the soil. Most of the plant roots are in the top 8 inches, though the roots go down much more deeply. So you always want to mix, not layer. You don't want roots to encounter segregated layers of different types of soil or compost. And after you're done with your soil preparation, you can, and even planting, you can top your boxes or garden beds with 1 inch of compost as a mulch. This is going to help with weeds, cool the soil, and then every time you water, it will add nutrients. So here's a no-till system, and this is with a vigorous winter cover crop. So this was our garden this year. So there is a drip system in this garden. So 3 rows of drip tape on top of the bed. And so then we weeded this down and then raked it up, all the debris back up on top of the beds. Then we put down the feather meal fertilizer and calcium, and put that on top, followed by compost. So at this point, you could choose, if you like to dig or till, you can do that. In our case, we want to do no-till. So we are going to cover this with black plastic and then wait 6 weeks for the cover crop to break down. Or again, you can rototill this and plant right away. So it just really depends on your individual situation. So obviously this is a large garden, but if you have an individual bed, you can use this method. And so it just really depends on your individual preference. So here's the black plastic that's put on. So some people will object to using so much plastic in the garden. So we intend to reuse this every year. So we put it on to smother the vigorous cover crop. And also, if you have Bermuda grass, to kill initial or pernicious weeds. This garden was, the first year we used this space as a garden was last year, and this site was almost entirely Bermuda grass, but we really wanted to do a vegetable garden. So we used this method last year, and then and covered it with black plastic, and then cut holes in the black plastic where the plants were to go, and then I laboriously dug each Bermuda grass out of each hole. So we did have it all tilled up last summer and with compost and fertilizer, and then laboriously uh, I pulled the Bermuda grass out and planted plants. And so that was really successful. I only spent about 2 hours weeding the whole summer. And the Bermuda grass was killed along with the bindweed. So this was really a great and super easy method of getting a difficult site started. So, so wood chip mulch is not appropriate under large trees and annual flowers and vegetables. This is often used as a mulch, which it works really well at to suppress the weeds, and to cool soil, cool the soil. But as wood chips are breaking down, they take a lot of nitrogen from the soil. And so consequently, annual plants like annual flowers and vegetables are really nutrient deprived and don't perform well. So wood chips are best used in pathways and compost used in beds. So I'm going to go back up to some of the this garden, and since we've got a little more time, and talk a little bit more about the soil here. So each spring, so probably starting in March, we will prepare these raised beds again by putting compost, first fertilizer, and then the compost on. These are dug each year just because the soil is so shallow, and then it's raked smooth. We put the drip system back on, and then plant vegetable plants. And so with using really great compost and the fertilizer, that there's no additional fertilization needed. We don't do any foliar feeding. We don't top dress, and then so consequently, these incredible mass of vegetation is sort of easily gained, and so there's a lot of different organic fertilizers that are available. If you just have a small garden, you might buy just a small box of it. Some of them don't last all summer, particularly if you're using them in raised beds that drain slowly, and you will want to will need to maybe top dress or dig in very, very lightly additional fertilizer during the course of the summer. So it just really depends on your individual situation. And I think the main thing is to look at how the plants grow and see how they're performing. If the foliage is looking fairly yellow and the plants are not performing well, then you will want to think about giving them some additional fertilizer, and some again will like to do foliar feed, and some will just get another box of fertilizer and just very lightly dig it in with your hands. So I think, and so let me just point out some of these vegetables. Again, you can mix vegetables and flowers together and have sort of a cut and come again garden like this winter garden, or you could just do simply one vegetable variety for the entire bed. So I think I'm going to finish early, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. So again, just these raised boxes, every spring and fall, a couple of inches of 1 or 2 inches of compost and some fertilizer really keeps them growing well. Seeding, you're going to need to mix this in, and always mix layers of different types of soil, and use compost as a mulch when you're all done planting. Your plants will really respond to that. Okay, so I think I'm going to end the slideshow and then be ready for questions.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Kate. So we've had a bunch of great questions come in. And just real quick, Ryan, I'm going to answer the questions that were already posed. If you could keep an eye on the chat box as new questions come in, we'll get to those.
Sounds great.
All right, so I'm going to just ask these to both of you guys, and whoever has the answer, feel free to speak up. So the first question we have is, I use horse manure in my beds to rest them each year. The soil is very tight. What can I add to loosen it? There's lots of worms. It's very rich, but it's extremely tight soil structure. Is there a way to kind of loosen that up without doing too much damage to the biome?
Well, I think if your soil is tight, so the soils are always at a point on the continuum. And so you're never sort of there. I think you want to change your practices over time. And when your soil is tight, that initially means that compost should be dug in. With new soils, or soils that are compacted or tight, you want to dig in compost for probably 2 to 3 years. And then soils will usually become more friable at that point, and then you could probably go to no-till.
All right, awesome.
So another thing that happens sometimes too with those high magnesium soils that I talked about, it's a good idea to put some gypsum on. It's a calcium sulfate, and it works really well for precipitating magnesium out of clay soil. So if your soils are really tight and hard, a lot of times we'll get benefits from adding gypsum to them. The pictures that Kate showed in the beginning of that awful soil at the Valley Oaks garden benefited greatly from calcium addition.
Yeah.
And some people use lime, but I typically would use lime for more acid soils, but for heavy clay soils, gypsum works better.
Great, thank you. We have a question, a couple questions regarding soil testing. So Brooke asks a question, is there a go-to lab to get your soil tested for NPK, pH, or is there a recommended soil testing kit?
Well, I think I'll leave that question to Glenn.
Sure. So the soil testing kits are not highly accurate. They kind of tell you it's kind of a presence absence sort of thing. So you really can't get great accuracy. They're, I suppose, better than nothing, but it's almost better to take a soil and send it to a commercial lab. And there's numerous commercial labs in California will run a whole profile for you for about $35 to $50, depending what you're getting. And A&L labs, Monarch labs, the Soil Lab Incorporated. If you go online, you can find numerous places that will offer soil testing for you. And typically, what you do is you try to get a representative sample. So when I sample from multiple spots, put it in a 5-gallon bucket, mix it up real good, and then take a dry sample. So if it's really wet, spread it out somewhere so you can let it dry, because that's what they're going to need to analyze it with. You get about a quart bag full of dry soil that's been mixed up from your multiple sample areas, and send it into the laboratory for analysis. And analysis is normally pretty quick. You normally get your results back in 1 to 2 weeks. About $35 to $50 plus postage or shipping.
Okay, awesome. We got tons of questions coming, so I apologize. We're gonna try to get everyone. If we don't, we'll try to maybe figure out a way to post some of these questions with the material. Related to kind of the soil testing is, Jill asks that she has a soil test done and has amended her garden soil per the recommendations. In subsequent or following up years, do they need to continue adding amendments to the soil at the same rate? Or, how would they know, or how would you know what is the best way to continue to amend the soil? Does she need to have that test redone every year?
Yeah, so I think, again, soils are always at a point on a continuum. And I think the important thing is to note how the plants are growing or grew this last season. Also, if you dig in the soil, I think probably just try digging with your hand. If it's really friable and easy to dig, and you could dig it with by hand or with just a little trowel, you'll know that you've really achieved a good point in terms of probably organic matter levels or friability of the soil. And so at this point, you could probably, in terms of the soil structure, you can just add an inch or two of compost a year if the soil is, and if the plant's health is really good, they're productive, they have great foliage cover. This is another really good indication that you're really doing a lot of things right. As Glenn used to say from many years ago, compost is king, and but also many composts don't have high levels of, say, nitrogen, so you may need to add some fertilizer as well. And so just really observing how your plants grow each year is just, they're really telling you a lot.
Awesome.
It's
Okay.
maybe all you need.
Yeah, I would kind of let me add to that real quick. So typically with commercial growing for perennial crops, we'll look at soils about every 3 years, and we just assume that some things are going to be deficient, like nitrogen is something that the crop uses in great quantities, and then the rainfall tends to leach it some. So we assume that we're going to have to add nitrogen fertilizer most seasons. It's just the way that it works. And soil testing we do periodically about every 3 years. But I agree with everything that Kate said about the importance of just your observations and how the soil looks and feels when you're digging it, and then how your crop is growing.
Awesome. Okay. There's a bunch of questions related to feather meal, and so I'll kind of give you a couple parts. Kate, maybe these are
Okay.
in your field. The first is, how much of this amendment should they use if they're already using some other type of fertilizer or compost? And do you have any recommendations for a lot of questions on other types of compost and amendments that are not animal-based products, if there's kind of some other product you recommend? And a lot of general questions on how much to use if you're mixing with compost and soil amendments. You know, what's your kind of ratio, or what are you looking, what's ideal?
Yeah, so those are sort of difficult questions. So, but just on the feather meal, well, difficult questions to answer precisely, because there's a lot of different fertilizers available. And
Sure.
it also is depending on a number of other aspects of your soil nutrient levels. And but generally with feather meal, I generally add enough to, say, like very heavily salt French fries sort of thing. There are directions on the bag, usually on the bags, that will direct you to the application rates. And so you can start there. It takes about a week for it to take effect, because soil biological activity are helping it break down. The warmer it gets, the more nitrogen is released, and so you might notice if you're using it on your lawn in the morning, your lawn is green, and in the afternoon, your lawn is emerald. It's like the cocaine of lawns. But other fertilizers have other bases. I'll just talk about a few that are out there, and then I'll go to the non-animal based ones. So of course we've all heard of blood meal and bone meal, and I generally there are fertilizers with those in them. They provide a lot of fertility or high levels of nutrients. I found that they don't last quite as long as the feather meal. Oftentimes that fertilizer blends are sold in stores. There's really a whole range of varieties these days, and so it pays to read the ingredient panel. I found that if you have a problem with raccoons and other sort of varmints digging in your garden, that probably staying away from the blood and bone meal is best. There's also fish meal fertilizers. There's water-soluble fertilizers, but in my mind, those are a lot of work because you have to keep reapplying them. As far as non-animal based, there alfalfa pellets and I think alfalfa meal can be used. I've gardened with them before. I did feel like there was kind of a lack of nitrogen in the plants in vegetables, at least when I've used just alfalfa meal and I think there was cottonseed meal and some other things. So composted manures are generally excellent, but they should be composted for weed seeds and any pathogens. So there's a whole range out there, and I think that going to the store and actually reading the labels will give you a lot of information. And again, the application rates are generally printed on the boxes or bags.
Okay. Is feather meal commonly available? People want to know where to get it.
Oh, feather meal?
Yeah.
Well, again, I think that some of the fertilizers that you'll see just in, say, farm supplies, hardware stores, will already have it in there. And so if you read some of the labels, you'll see it. I find a good range of fertilizers in the grow stores that I think cater mostly to marijuana growing. They have a great, amazing range of fertilizers. Some farm supplies, a lot of farm supplies have really excellent array of fertilizers, including feather meal. You could always ask too. And I've seen boxes, small boxes of it, or 20 or 30 or 50 pound sacks of it as well. So I think it's becoming more prevalent.
So I worked a lot. Yeah. So I worked a lot with feather meal about 25 years ago when we were first looking at concentrated organic fertilizers, and it really needs to be pelletized to be able to handle easily in its pure form. Basically, what they do is they steam up the feathers and then grind them. So seems like an endless supply because Americans love chicken. And what I found with it is that they also use it in dog food. So my dogs have always liked feather meal. When I put it on the garden in a concentrated form, they dig it up and lick it out. And so that's kind of a little bit of an issue. But in terms, I just did a quick calculation. So if you have a garden that's like 10 feet by 10 feet or 100 square feet, you need about 5 pounds of feather meal to properly fertilize it, to bring it up to the equivalent of 200 pounds per acre nitrogen, which is what a lot of vegetable growers would put on in standard American agriculture. And it is like a time-release fertilizer because basically bacteria and fungi have to break it down. And what we found is that it releases nitrogen for about 12 weeks. So Kate's absolutely right. If you do a good application early in the spring, you'll probably have adequate nitrogen most of the year. One other thing that works good too is to get a bale of alfalfa in the fall when you put your vegetable beds down for sleep, and spread the alfalfa out, then put the compost on top, and that makes a fairly stable form of nitrogen then that will be released in the springtime when you work the beds up and get ready to plant again.
Okay. Speaking of compost, there's lots of different questions on compost. So try to summarize some of these. Some of them are based on, is there a compost that's better to use for flowers versus vegetables? Is there a thing such as using too much compost? What's enough compost? Can you use straw in your compost? What about if you use different types of animal-based manures? So kind of along those lines, it really sounds like, you just got to really treat it really well before you use it, but the source, depending on what you need for nutrients, can be important too. Mixing compost with green waste. Any thoughts on these general kind of questions and thoughts and ideas?
Yeah. Well, I think again, just going back to what soil type do you have? So do you have sand, silt, or clay? As the earlier question, is your soil compacted? Can you dig it with your hand, or does it require a lot of effort with a shovel? These are really going to give you direction on how much to add. And so again, the worse your soil is, whether it's sand or clay or compacted, hard to dig, you may want to start with 3 or 4 inches of compost added. Probably after 3 or 4 or 5 years, you're going to only need to add 1 or 2 inches of compost a year. So you want to just really adjust your methods over time, and assess your soil over time. If you've got nice loam, just one or 2 inches of compost each growing season is generally going to be enough. I really love composted green waste, and many municipalities are putting out excellent composted green waste. You really want to make sure it doesn't have wood chips in it if you're using it for vegetables, and so it's fairly fine, but has a little bit of coarse matter in it. The earthworms really seem to love the coarse matter rather than fine matter. But generally it's often low in nitrogen, so you will need to add some fertilizer as well.
Okay.
So Glenn has some.
Yeah.
I think all composts need to understand that not all composts are created equally, and depending on the feed source, you almost have to have a little bit of a test. So if you're buying from a compost producer, you can take a look at it. And we talk about carbon nitrogen ratio. So at some point, if you have too much carbon, it's going to suck up all the nitrogen, which, remember, Kate said, don't put on coarse chips into your garden, like a garden mulch. The garden mulches are good for your shrubs and trees, but don't mix it into the soil, because what will happen is that the soil microbes will want to break that down, and they'll suck all the nitrogen out of the soil trying to break it down. So we go with composts that have a ratio of about 20 parts of carbon to 1 part of nitrogen. And they actually, if you ask the compost maker, they'll tell you whether, what the ratio is. And when you have that kind of a ratio, it's a very good compost for making herbaceous annual stuff grow. If it's higher than that, it's probably not going to be a good source of nutrients. And like Kate said, you can use it, which is the case with a lot of our green waste, but we're probably going to have to add extra fertilizer to get plants to grow well.
Awesome. It's kind of
that's kind of nerdy, but
I think that's the level
it's a
we're
little
at.
nerdy, but that's how we figured it out.
No, that's where
Yep.
people are asking some really good detailed questions. So I think you're probably getting exactly what they want. This is kind of an interesting question. Somebody wants to know if using eucalyptus leaves is an issue, or if it's good for mulch.
Yeah, I think eucalyptus trees are best placed in the green bin and sent off to a composting facility. They're really waxy and coarse and take a very long time to break down, and they may have I think they're called phytochemicals or oils that are going to be detrimental to plants growing underneath them.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. Kind of off topic, but similarly related, out of interest for me. Is there any issue with using used wine barrels as raised planter beds?
They're really popular, and I think some people who just don't have much room, just have a patio, they can be an excellent place to grow vegetables. I think just keep in mind that you're treating them like a raised box, and so you want to try to get some good quality potting soil to fill them, and mix some compost in with it, so you have better water retention and better nutrients, or higher and longer lasting levels of nutrients. Just keep in mind the size of the soil, size of the pot or the barrel. And I think sometimes people try to put too many plants in them, and so they're all the planter becomes root bound very quickly, and then the plants really never do the best that they can.
So I would like to add to that.
Sure.
Containerized, adding to that, containerized gardening in a warm climate like Ukiah tends to be difficult, and I find that used oak barrels cut in half are about the right size of something that won't overheat. Because with smaller containers with these really pretty clay pots and things, they just cook the plant in the sunshine. So I find that oak barrels are about the right size. Now, that being said, remember an oak barrel filled with good soil and water is going to weigh somewhere around 250 to 300 pounds. So you got to be a little careful about where you put them and make sure that you've got a solid place for them. And if you put them on your deck, for instance, make sure that there's a gap underneath it too, so that water can leak through, because otherwise you're going to end up rotting wood. So best kept on gravel, kind of in your garden area. And a good way to do some gardening and intensively on a patio. And everything else that Kate said, I agree with 100%.
Awesome. Okay. We're getting near the end. A couple good questions still. There's a few questions related to clay. So I'll just ask one that's pretty detailed that I think we'll kind of get at the other questions. So I'm just going to read this question directly because it's a little complex in my mind. Is it better or do you get more production from a garden to remove the deep layers of clay and put new soil into the empty cavity space? To try to amend or insert fertilizers and compost and then put back active layers of soil. So there's a lot of questions on really dealing with soil, with lots of clay-rich soils. For example, is it okay to rototill clay-rich soils? Is that bad in general for your garden? And so in general, there's lots of questions. How do we deal with really clay-rich soils?
Yeah, well, clay is good. Clay soils tend to be very fertile. They retain water well. They need a lot of compost. So you want to, so you would probably want to like initially add like 5 inches of compost in these soils, and you're probably going to have to till them or dig them for probably 4-5 years, possibly, to build the soil organic matter levels up and to create a good soil structure, because your goal is to create drainage. You want oxygen in your soil. Most of the plant roots are in the top 8 inches of the soil, and soil organisms are also found mostly in the top 8 inches of the soil, also to a lesser extent in deeper layers. So you generally don't want to sort of mix deep layers with shallow layers, because different soil organisms are living in different soil layers. So the old sort of double digging was really unnecessary and detrimental. And so just digging a shovels or forks depth is important. You don't want to work these soils, as Glenn mentioned, when they're wet. If you grasp a handful of soil and squish it in your hand, if it sticks together, it's too wet. So wait till it sort of gently crumbles when it's more dry to work these soils. But it takes a little time, but you will have really excellent fertile soils with clay. Clay is good.
So I would just add to that 2 things. One is that calcium, really important if you're dealing with a clay soil. So when you start, depending on a soil test to find out how much magnesium is in the soil, which is really common here, particularly like in Lake County along Big Valley and along the lake, make sure that you're putting some gypsum or lime in, depending on what your magnesium content is, because the calcium in both of those compounds will help the soil kind of aggregate better and form that kind of cake-like structure that we're discussing, and stop it from being so hard when it dries and so gloppy when it's wet. So calcium is really, really important. I've gone through this whole thing. Should you replace the soil or not if you have really bad soil? And I used to tough it out. I'm lucky because I'm a farmer, so I have a lot of equipment available to me. So there's been times though where I've said, give up on the native soil and replace it. But understand something: if you want to do that, if you want to bring in a really nice soil, it's expensive and time consuming to get the old soil dug out and removed and new good soil brought in. So it just depends on the scale that you have to do this. If it's a small area, you can think about replacing the soil, but that's always expensive and hard to do compared to working with what you have.
Awesome. That's good advice. Saves you some effort and work too on building your beds. So we have a lot of questions on cover crops, and I'm just going to generalize it and say, it's in regards to soil building and kind of protecting soil structure. Do you have any recommendations for the best types of crops to use, rotation patterns, anything like that?
Yeah, well, Glenn is the cover crop king.
Yeah, that's
So,
true.
yeah, I'll let him answer.
This is all you, Glenn.
Sure. So the whole thing with cover crops is that you have to have a garden where you can have time to rotate your beds, because cover crops work good, but they take time to grow and build organic matter. On a large agricultural scale, it's the best way to add organic matter into your soil. And we have about 4 different kinds of cover crops. There's legumes, which add nitrogen, and those would be like the peas, vetches, beans. We have grasses, and grasses are really good at kind of gluing all the soil particles together to aggregate them and improve soil structure. We have what I just call carbonaceous crops that they grow fast and they add a lot of carbon to the soil. So these would be things like mustards, are really good for that. And then we have cover crops that we put in for other reasons. So it might be that we're trying to discourage nematodes. It might be that we're trying to encourage beneficial insects. So those are kind of specialty cover crops. But in general, in the North Coast, what we really like to work with is our winter cover crops. And it really works best if there's a part of your garden that you can rotate in and out, because cover crops take time. So you plant them usually mid-October and work them in about now. So that means you've got to have a pretty good window to be able to grow them, to allow them to mature enough to where they're going to do you a lot of good. And so we seed them mid-October, and we're turning them under when they're flowering, which is about right now, because that's when the maximum nitrogen availability is, and that's when, if you're growing grasses, that's when they're going to break down the best. So a typical farm mix is we'll do peas, vetch, and oats or triticale or some of the other grasses, mix them together, plant them in October, turn them under now, and you'll get a lot of benefit from it. It's a really nice practice to do, but it does take up time from your garden, because especially here, we're still picking tomatoes in October, and we're going, man, I don't want to take the tomatoes out. I still have a bunch left in here. So you have to think about that as you're sort of planning for them. There are summer cover crops as well. There's a few things we don't commonly see, like buckwheat and lespedeza and some other kind of obscure ones, but they can do really well in the summertime as well if you want to rotate summer cover crops into your garden system. But it does take time. It's also good to rest your crops too, because if you grow tomatoes in the same spot for more than 3 or 4 years, you're going to start running into disease problems. And cover crops help break up that cycle. So this is another way that we'd use them. And we'll talk more about that in the 4th show when we talk about caring for your garden.
Yeah, just to add about that. So when you are growing cover crops and you don't want to till your soil, if you're doing no-till, or if you can't till, but you still want to use cover crops as part of your soil fertility and development recipe, you can just cut them, weed eat them. You can cut them with scissors, with head shears, and then rake them back on the bed, and then cover the bed with black plastic for about 6 weeks. And then the cover crop will be broken down by then. So you've just skipped the whole tilling and digging, and your soil will be nice and soft and fluffy and ready to plant. So you could just pull the plastic off then, roll it up, put it away for next year, or you could leave it on. So just depending on what you're looking for.
Awesome. Okay, we're at time. One more comment though I want to make. We had a lot of questions on, Kate, if you had resources for dealing with Bermuda grass, and we don't necessarily have to answer that right now. Maybe we can post, if you do have any good references, we can post those on the website with the video. But a lot of people are interested in the magic that you did to get rid of that grass and get that garden going again.
Yeah, well, I have several step-by-step or two step-by-step situations on how to get rid of it without spraying it in the last of these series of the class. So I'll be going over that in detail, and Glenn can address spraying for those who want to take that approach.
All right, fantastic. All right, does anybody have presenters? Do either of you have any last minute comments or just anything you want to say before we finish for this particular workshop?
Yeah, I'm just really excited that everyone is tuned in, and I think this is the year of the garden. Since we have to stay home anyway, we might as well do something productive, and it's a nice way to go outside and
Yeah.
clear your head. I'm starting the day with about 30 minutes of weeding because I have a pretty good sized landscape and there's lots of weeds. So good exercise, good connection with nature, and I just feel so much better when I've had a chance to be in my garden before the day starts.
Yeah. Well, I just especially in this time, am just so pleased at how gardens bring people together, as with putting them in, with sharing plants, with sharing vegetables, with admiring our friends and neighbors, various gardens. It's just been every year. It's a fun experience, and I think and now especially, I think it's become a very meaningful experience and way to connect with people.
Awesome. Well, thank you both, Glenn and Kate, for your time.